But fundamentally, these biases don't creep in because the organizations are anti-India. They creep in because, forgive me, India's intellectual class is anti-India. As a class, not as individuals.
No. India's intellectual class is anti-India, or are you saying that they are anti-Mr. Modi and are conflating the two? Or are you conflating the two?
There is a bit of both. They're certainly anti-BJP, anti-Mr. Modi, as a class, not every individual. But imagine that in a couple years you get a UPA government.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Will they tear down the Ram Mandir?
I'll give you another statistic. 24% of Indian Muslims say they face some form of discrimination on account of their religion. Now that sounds bad. Until you realize first, 72% of Indian Muslims say they've never faced discrimination on account of their religion. What's more, we can take that 24% of Indian Muslims say they've at some point in their lives faced religious discrimination and compare it to the same question asked in the United States. So the Pew Research Center, in a separate survey, asked exactly the same question with exactly the same wording in the United States, asking about racial discrimination. 80% of African Americans say they face discrimination. 46% of Hispanic Americans. 42% of Asian Americans. And only 24% of Indian Muslims. In other words, self-reported discrimination in India is, for Muslims and for Christians is lower than for Asian Americans.
नमस्ते, स्वागत है आपका इंडिया दिस वीक के नए एपिसोड में और मैं हूं आपकी होस्ट आमना अंसारी.
Hi, this is Khalid Beg and welcome to yet another episode of India This Week by Amana and Khalid. So the gentleman who's sitting in front of us, last year India didn't know who he was, but today most of us know who he is after that epic face-off with Rajdeep Sardesai in an India Today conclave. We have none other than Salvatore Babones with us. I'll still introduce him. I mean, he's a professor of sociology. He's an American citizen based out of Sydney, associate professor at the Sydney University. He's an out-and-out academician, has co-authored 13 books. And since last 6 months, he seems to be quite a rage in India. So welcome, Salvatore, again to your second home, India.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
All right. Salvatore, let's get straight into the thick of things. In your first interaction with Rajdeep, which went pretty viral, and India woke up to this phenomenon of Salvatore, you said India's intellectual class, quote unquote, is anti-India, and this is something even Rajdeep asked you to explain. That piqued my interest while I was researching for the interview. So I want to know from you, why is India's intellectual class anti-India? One, and who are these quote-unquote intellectuals you're referring to?
So first, I thought it was funny that this was the controversial thing that came out of the interview, because if I said American intellectuals are anti-American, everyone would shrug their shoulders and say, of course they are. Australian intellectuals are anti-Australia. Of course they are. And in India, I guess it hit a raw nerve because everyone knew it was true, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. But I didn't mean it in a generic sense of every intellectual is anti-Indian. Remember, I was explaining that in the context of explaining why the international democracy rankings rated India so low. And a key thing I wanted to communicate as a statistical methodologist is that the three ranking systems don't, and in particular, the Varieties of Democracy Institute rankings, which rank India the lowest, they don't send fact-finding missions to India to determine the level of its democracy. They ask Indian intellectuals, what is your rating? Now, that's not an omnibus, what is your rating? They ask them a series of questions. How good is freedom of expression in India? How good is freedom of association in India, et cetera? And those questions determine the democracy evaluation. So these negative evaluations that everyone in India seems to think are neo-colonial Western anti-India reports have nothing to do with Western anti-Indianness. These Western organizations are just reporting back the negative evaluations of India made by India's own intellectuals. So it's in that context that I was emphasizing this. And, look, Indian intellectuals, those surveyed by the Rise of Democracy Institute, rank freedom of expression in India lower than Iranians rank freedom of expression in Iran. Okay, India's journalists rank freedom of journalism in India lower than Hong Kong journalists rate freedom of reporting in Hong Kong. Now, it's easy to laugh at these things because, of course, freedom of expression is more widely available in India than in Iran. Of course, Indian journalism is freer to report than journalists in Hong Kong. Everyone knows this, yet it's Indians. It's not Reporters Sans Frontières based in Paris. It's not Rise of Democracy Institute based in Sweden who are saying that India has no freedom of expression and no freedom of journalism. It's Indians who are saying this. And their voices are simply being recycled back through the rankings and amplified by that Western venue to be reported back into India.
Right. So actually, I have two questions following your statement. But first, I will go with this, that you said that Indian intellectual class actually giving this feedback to this ranking system and giving the very worst feedback, even that India is worse than the Iran or Hong Kong on several measurement. So, but don't you think this Indian intellectual has some kind of expectation from India? And what they are doing, basically, they are comparing their country to the Western society, and that's why they're marking Indian system in such a low way. Don't you think that could be a reason?
I'm sure that's part of it, and that there's some benchmarking to a perceived golden environment somewhere on the outside, but part of it represents their own actual opinions, because they're not being asked the generic question, are Indians free to express their opinion? They're being asked a series of specific questions with specific options for answers, in which they're rating India on, for example, to what extent does the government interfere with reporting? And they're answering that news reports cannot appear in the Indian media if the government opposes them. Now, that's patently false. I mean, there's plenty of Indian news media that is thoroughly critical of the government. Yet that kind of evaluation being provided by Indian intellectuals is I think, problematic. Now, so to emphasize, the Indians who are answering these surveys are not being asked, how would you rate India compared to America? How would you rate India compared to Iran? They're simply being asked to rate the freedom of expression or the freedom of reporting in India. And they're giving us these bizarre answers, but they're not alone. I mean, you'll see I'm typing here, and that's because I'm going to read you something that Australian reporters have said about Australia. And of course, here in Australia, we accept that there's very much freedom of the press in Australia. I don't think anyone outside of Australia would think that there's no freedom of press in Australia. Yet, in the Reporters Sans Frontières country report in Australia, it says, Australian journalists do not face violence or arbitrary detention, but the perception of their security situation is no less worrying. In a 2021 study, nearly 90% of them said they feared an increase in threats, harassment, or intimidation, starting with threats from the government. Now, you might laugh at that if it's said about Australia, and we may not take it seriously. But what if someone said that about India? You'd take it very seriously. And so, I think we, to some extent, have journalists everywhere, intellectuals everywhere, have these kind of overinflated senses of concern. But, at least in Australia, we're not so worried that really represents the situation. Even though Reporters Sans Frontières says that in their evaluation of Australia, we don't worry about it so much. Yeah. When we hear it about India, we take it seriously and it gets reported as news.
Get it. So basically, I would say that it's more than reality. It's the perception of reality in the mind of intellectuals of India. Basically, that's what we see in the ranking system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's being recycled back to India as news in a way that that Australian report wasn't ever reported in the Australian media. No one took it seriously.
Yeah. So my second question about the ranking system, when you talk about the ranking index being unfair to Indian democracy, so I mean, can you define a little more? What do you mean by that? This ranking system are not very reliable in itself, because the kind of feedback they are taking, they're not going into the India and they're just consulting to the Indian intellectual and journalism, or you can say that there is a kind of partition approach of Western intellectual towards India as well, or it is both? Like, how would you explain it?
Look, it's much worse than that. And in fact, I just published a major report on the VDEM rankings, Varieties of Democracy Institute rankings, called Inside the VDEM Rankings. You can find it online if you just Google that. The Varieties of Democracy Institute rankings for electoral democracy, their flagship rankings, simply do not measure democracy, period. It says democracy in the title, but they have 5 sub-indices of democracy. The 2 objective components rate all countries as democracies on the basis of what their constitutions say. So when the Vietnamese constitution says that everyone has a right to vote and all officials are elected by vote, they just give 100% then. Even though Vietnam's a communist country with only one party allowed to run, they get a perfect score. The same, and even India doesn't quite get a perfect score, because until recently, 2 members of Lok Sabha were appointed to represent the Anglo-Indian community. So India gets a 0.996, whereas Vietnam gets a perfect score. Hong Kong gets a perfect score. Why? Because in Hong Kong, nominally, everybody can vote, and everybody can vote, and all officials are elected. Perfect score. VDEM even says in its documentation, they do not adjust for the meaningfulness of elections. Sham, in their word, sham elections count the same as actual elections. All right, so right there, they're not measuring democracy. That's 2 out of 5 of the main subcomponents of VDEM. The third one is the one on free and fair elections. On that one, which is semi-objective, on that one, they ask experts simply to tell them on 8 metrics, are elections free and fair? Now, if you said, are elections free and fair, you would think in Hong Kong, elections are less free and fair than in India. And if you ask that overall question, people would certainly say Hong Kong elections are not free and fair. But that's not what VDEM asks people. VDEM asks, under free and fair elections, they ask, was there violence at elections? In Hong Kong, no violence. India, yeah, there's occasional violence. Was the electoral roll complete? Hong Kong, perfect electoral roll. In India, of course, there are questions about citizenship in India. What year your parents migrated to India? Does that make you a citizen? Okay, so there are questions about the electoral roll. They ask, does the Electoral Commission have full control over elections? Hong Kong, absolutely. India, well, there are issues of how far the Electoral Commission's remit goes, right? So you go on and on down these indicators. So although these indicators say that they're measuring free and fair elections, in fact, they're measuring a bunch of technical criteria on which Hong Kong scores dramatically better than India, despite the fact that in Hong Kong, you can only vote for government-approved candidates, right? So now we have 3 out of the 5 where Hong Kong outperforms India on democracy. All you're left with are the two subjective indicators of freedom of association and freedom of expression. Those are the 2 where they rely on expert evaluations. And on those 2, okay, India beats Hong Kong on those 2, but India does far worse than many other countries on those 2, with the result that India, because it's rated poorly for freedom of expression, fairly or not, we could debate, but it's rated poorly for freedom of expression, but it gets no credit for actually having elections. Right? The result is that countries that don't have elections, but score a little better than India for freedom of expression, and here I'm looking specifically at Vietnam, for example, end up ranking very similarly to India. Okay, one of the closest comparisons to India, and one that actually scores higher than India, is Ivory Coast. And I like using Ivory Coast as a comparison case because it makes this comparison so direct. In Ivory Coast, the president won election with 95% of the vote. His main opponent was exiled on political charges. The opposition candidates reported severe harassment. They were unable to run their elections as an opposition. Okay, it is a terribly flawed democracy. Yet, on all the kind of criteria listed by VDEM, did you have elections? Was everyone allowed to vote? Are you allowed to form associations? Are you allowed to speak your mind? Can foreign NGOs operate in your country? Yeah, it did fine. The only problem Ivory Coast had was you're not allowed to vote for anyone except the president. But that's not in the VDEM methodology. Now, it's not there because VDEM was devised by a bunch of Swedish people based on democratic theory that was developed in Europe. And the mindset they had, they never imagined that they would be ranking countries that simply didn't have elections. In their mind, well, we're comparing Sweden to Norway to Switzerland. And these other issues, are opposition parties allowed to run? Just wasn't in their imagination as an indicator of democracy. Or if it was only one among many, many indicators. So instead of measuring democracy, can you vote for who you want? Can anyone run for office? And can you vote for who you want? VDEM focuses on all these technical correlates for democracy, enablers for democracy, things that should be in a democracy index. I mean, is your electoral register complete? Yeah, that you could have that in a democracy index. There's nothing wrong with that. But the fundamental question in a democracy index should be, can you oppose the government? Can you fire your leaders? That's not in VDEM. So by design, it doesn't really measure democracy. Every country gets pretty much the same score on the objective indicators because it's just an analysis of constitutions. And then the experts give their opinion on the subjective indicators. And India gets savaged on the subjective indicators. And so India ends up being, it's 108 in the world, but that's not 108 among 180 democracies. That's 108 among all countries, which makes it probably about the worst ranked democracy in the entire world. I just don't think that's a meaningful.
This sounds more like we dumb
summary.
than we dem, because these are very dumbest analysis.
Look, there are serious problems, serious methodological problems with VDEM. And I could get into the statistical property. Myself, I come from a background in measurement theory and measurement applied to cross-national data. That's, I'm not an India expert. I'm a quantitative comparative sociologist who started studying India. Right. And there's serious methodological problems with VDEM. We'll see if they address them. I doubt they will. These problems have been there from the beginning. I'm apparently, bizarrely, the first person to point them out. But knowing other academics, I really doubt that there will be much appetite at VDEM to recalibrate its entire database just because one critic doesn't like it.
Right. So also, Salvatore, organizations like VDEM or VDEM, we call them, they and organizations like them say that journalists, are living under fear in democratic secular India, and they put the rankings even behind Iraq and Pakistan, all these countries which are under perennial conflict, and it's dangerous to be a journalist, and of course, living here as Indians, you realize this doesn't make sense. But there comes someone like you who puts it out academically with numbers, and that's what you did in Rajdeep's interview as well. So I want you to come to specifically journalists, because that propaganda has lasted for decades now, since I've been a child.
More journalists are killed in India than in any other country outside China.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fact. More people have black hair in India than in any country outside China. Fact. More people have noses, lips, and teeth than any country outside. Fact. It's an irrelevant fact. You obviously have to adjust for population. Adjusting for population in India, in the last 10 years, there have been 3.5 violent journalist deaths per billion people. Rest of world, 6.3 billion. 6.3 per billion. In other words, journalists are much safer, about twice as safe in India as in rest of world. And keep in mind that India is a poor country with multiple internal insurgencies, with all of these problems that should lead India to being a violent place for journalists. In fact, journalists are safer than in India than in rest of world, dramatically safer, despite it being such a poor country. That should be a good news message for India. Now, I don't so much fault the NGO that puts out the report, because look, NGOs raise money on raising the alarm. So they put out alarming statistics, number of journalists killed in Uttar Pradesh, number of journalists killed in India. And let's face it, we want journalist deaths to be managed down to zero. We don't want anyone to be killed when reporting the news.
Absolutely.
But organizations that pick this up, whether it's news editors or academics or VDEM, which highlighted these statistics in its report, have an obligation to be skeptical. Right? We should always be skeptical. I mean, I'm always very skeptical. People send me stuff every day. Salvatore, what about this thing? And it's like, you know what? We exercise some skepticism. Just the most rudimentary skepticism would have edited out this figure, or would have turned it around into evidence of a benign environment for journalists in India. It's just unconscionable that this statistic continues to be reported as evidence that journalists and journalism are under threat in India. I mean, there are threats to journalism everywhere, but the threats probably have a lot more to do with low pay in India than to do with actual threats of physical violence.
Right. Amna, your question?
Yeah, so I'm going to ask a very different question. So I was watching your interview with Rajdeep Sardesai, and you were talking about the Muslim of India, that the question was that Muslim representation in Indian parliament, and you said this is not to do anything, maybe it's not has to do anything with discrimination against minority, but the fact that Muslims are not well educated and they are more poor, so that's why they are not getting the representation. But my question is that it can I interpret is that it's like there's no discrimination against Muslim at all, or you're saying it cannot be all about the discrimination, there are nuances?
Look, there's discrimination against people of all kinds everywhere. If we want to be systematic about it, we have to ask, what evidence is there of levels of discrimination? So at the India Today conclave, the first thing I pointed out was, how many Muslims are here in the audience at the India Today conclave?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, let's not be too precious about the Muslim underrepresentation in parliament if Muslims are also underrepresented in a liberal environment that wants to see progress for Muslims in India. Okay. Second, the data. So Muslims are dramatically underrepresented in the Lok Sabha. But Muslim representation in the Lok Sabha rose between 2014 and 2019. Not a lot, but it rose. Therefore, the fact that Muslim representation in the Lok Sabha is very low could not have been used as evidence as to why India's democracy declined between 2014 and 2019. I mean, you might say that it didn't increase enough, but you can't say it declined, since the actual representation went up. So here we have a false narrative being manufactured. Now more broadly about the status of Indian Muslims. Look, I'm going to talk to you as a sociologist, not as not person to person, as individuals. India was set up to have a problem of Muslim social exclusion. Many elite, of course, there was the creation of Pakistan and by extension Bangladesh, but Pakistan in 1947 being created as a homeland, not really just for India's Muslims, but as a place where elite Muslims could find political success. Jinnah, if you go back and read the period documents, Jinnah wanted to be the father of a country, and he knew he wasn't going to be the father of India. That was going to be Gandhi. So he had to have a country where he could, and not just Jinnah and a whole realm of politicians under Jinnah, to get elected, needed to have a Muslim majority country where they could get elected. And so they got that. Okay, many leading Indian Muslims also emigrated to Pakistan, where they felt they could have greater success. Okay, so the people who were left in India at partition were much poorer and less educated on average than the Muslim population of British India had been. So post-1947 India inherited an inbuilt problem of Muslim poverty and social exclusion. Day one, right? It was always going to be a problem for India. Now, I think arguably India has not done enough over the last 70 years to reduce those levels of poverty and social exclusion.
Okay.
That said, the problem was set from the beginning. It persists till today. The question we have today is, how much of a problem is it? Now, in general, it's hard to quantify these sorts of things, but we actually have very good data on India's Muslims, because in 2019-2020, the Pew Research Center, the world's premier social survey organization, did a major survey of religion in India. They surveyed 29,999 households. I'm rehearsing that number, one short of 30,000 households. Major survey, 86% response rate, conducted in 17 languages, fully nationally representative. I mean, this was one of the best social survey, probably the best social survey ever conducted in India. In that survey, Muslims reported, 24% of India's Muslims reported that they have faced discrimination at some point in their lives on account of their religion. Now, 24% sounds bad. It's almost a quarter. But as a comparativist, I always want to have some metric against which to compare this. I mean, lifetime, I mean, have you ever suffered discrimination? Could be as simple as, 20 years ago, someone called you a name. Right. I mean, we want to have some benchmark for this. So we go to the United States. Pew did the same question in the United States, only instead of asking about religion, it asked about race. 80% of African Americans said they'd face discrimination. I think it was 46% of Hispanic Americans, I'd have to look up the number, said they faced discrimination. 42% of Asian Americans said they'd face discrimination. Okay. So on the same exact question, worded the same way, with the same choices offered, Asian Americans report dramatically greater discrimination than Indian Muslims. Okay. So is there a problem of discrimination for Indian Muslims? I'm sure there is. Okay, anecdotal reports suggest people have been discriminated against. How big is that problem? Well, if the problem is nowhere near African American levels, is even much less than what Asian Americans face in the US, all right, it's a manageable problem. I mean, I think there's still lots of circumstantial evidence of social exclusion of Muslims. There's residential segregation. I don't know how much of that residential segregation is voluntary. So on the Pew survey, they asked about it, and people said they preferred residential segregation. But we have the problem, do they prefer it because that's what they, in their hearts, really want, or do they prefer it for pragmatic reasons? They feel that if they didn't segregate, they would face problems, or their children would face problems. It's hard to get at that in a social survey. But we know that there's extensive residential segregation in India between Muslims and Hindus, especially. Christians and Hindus less so, but Muslim and Hindus especially. We know that Muslims in India are systematically poorer than Hindus, but it depends on the state and the environment. There are plenty of very poor Hindus in India. It's not like all Hindus. It's not like America, where to be black is to be poor. Statistically, the concentration of African Americans in America's poor is so extreme. The concentration of Muslims among India's poor is noticeable. It's statistically significant, but it's nowhere like as extreme as the concentration of Aboriginal poverty in America, in Australia, or African American poverty in the US. So overall, as a quantitative sociologist, I look at the problems of India's Muslims, and I say, well, there's definitely a need for reform. The fact that the BJP doesn't run a single Muslim candidate is embarrassing. I've even said, look, even if it's going to cost them at the polls, and their reasoning is, well, we don't run the candidates because they'll lose if we run them, and we just want to win. Well, I think that's not really good enough. I mean, if they were a minority party with 12 seats, all right. But being the dominant political party in the country, I think now they have much more of a responsibility to act like the natural party of government. They've been in government. They've been elected twice now. I mean, 2014, maybe it was a fluke. 2019, they didn't know they would win. Well, 2024, they're going in with every expectation of being, of winning an outright majority again in Lok Sabha. They can afford to risk a few seats by running Muslim candidates. If they don't, I think that will reflect badly on the BJP as a responsible party in Indian politics. Now, I don't know if they will or they won't. You guys probably know the politics better than I do. I'll wait and see what happens after the election. So I think there are lots of things that Indians can and should do, that India can and should do, to reduce the social exclusion of Indian Muslims and to bring greater parity between Muslims and Hindus in Indian society. But the situation, whatever your subjective experience may be, and whatever listener's subjective experience may be, objectively, the situation is nowhere near as serious as what we quantitatively know the situation of African Americans and Aboriginal Australians, and for that matter, Muslims in the UK and Muslims in France. We know these are far worse examples of social exclusion. Somalis in Sweden have extreme social exclusion, far worse than anything we see in India.
Obviously. The thing is that Indian Muslims are not immigrants. They have been here for the centuries. So the inclusion is there, like Hindu, Muslim, they live their life together. Just that I don't know why they prefer to live in their ghettos. They don't want to intermingle. But the next generation, the more educated they are being in the metropolitan society, it's changing drastically as well.
We hope so. We hope so.
Yeah. This the question. It's not very academic question, but do you think Indian Muslim can be someday Indian prime minister? Sorry, we all
Yeah, president there has been.
Yeah,
So that's not an issue. Look, prime minister. So whenever you say someday, the obvious answer is yes.
Yes.
Someday soon, I think it's very unlikely, and it's unfortunate that the primary. The most valid criticism of Indian democracy is that it does tend to be majoritarian. Now, majoritarian doesn't simply mean majority wins. That's what democracy is all about. Majoritarian means that majority communities expect that someone from their own community will receive benefits, that are disproportionate to what they should receive under a purely under a purely a fair division of spoils, if you will, or division of benefits from government. Now, Indian governance is not majoritarian, right? So if you look at the gas stoves program, if you look at income support programs for the poor, there's really very little evidence of majoritarianism here. When you look at things like road building, there's some evidence. But again, it's nothing compared to the evidence we have in the United States of African-American neighborhoods, having transportation deficits. It's really extreme in the U.S. So there are problems. They're probably minor. When it comes to politics, though, there is a lot of religion in politics in India. As a secularist Western liberal, it's something that I find dismaying and something that I think politicians have a responsibility to lead. That is, it shows poor leadership when politicians aren't mature enough to say, well, yeah, maybe some of my voters would react well to religious jingoism, but I'll be a leader and teach them not to do that, right? I'd like to see more of that sort of leadership in India. That said, this is at the, this is at like, are we judging here in Australia? We have a system for grading. I'm a teacher that goes, pass, credit, distinction, high distinction. Well, this is kind of at the level of if India wants a high distinction, it should do more of this. And I think at this point, it's clear that there's too much operationalization of Hinduism in politics, also of Islam, Muslim vote bank politics, also of Christian vote bank politics. But the political Hinduism does, I think, militate against the idea that there would be the possibility of a Muslim prime minister. First of all, that Muslim prime minister, if it were soon, would have to be a BJP prime minister. I think there's no evidence, the only major alternative, there's no evidence that the Congress is going to run a Muslim prime ministerial candidate. I think they would view that as kind of the kiss of death for Congress among Hindu communities. The Aam Aadmi Party has doubled down on its Hinduism in recent, in the last year or so. I think it would be very bad for India if it got a Muslim prime minister by stealth. So, for example, if Congress ran Rahul Gandhi as its main face, won the election, and then said, well, we're going to surprise everyone. We're going to have a Muslim be our prime minister. I think that would be very bad for democracy because it would create all sorts of anger and frustration that would be bad for society, even if it set a precedent. So unfortunately, no, I don't think India is likely to have a Muslim prime minister anytime soon. That said, look, it took 200 years for America to have an African-American president. And as I remind everybody, Barack Obama was half white. His mother is Irish. And he was only African-American to the extent that his father was an African immigrant. He is not descended from slaves. America has never had a president or vice president who was descended from slaves. They have African skin color, but they're not descended from slaves. And, so I think our expectation, so on the one hand, I'm dismayed that I have to say, no, it's very unlikely that India would have a Muslim prime minister. On the other hand, let's benchmark that. When are other countries going to have, when is America going to have an African-American descended from slaves president? When is England, we have our first Hindu prime minister of the UK, when is UK going to have a Muslim prime minister? Would the Labour Party in the UK have the courage to, the Muslims are a big component of the Labour Party in the UK. Would they have the courage to nominate a Muslim leader, not just for mayor of London, where everyone's very cosmopolitan, but as leader of the Labour Party, right? So I think a sense of perspective is always in order. India's not going to get a high distinction on this one, but it's still going to get a pretty good score.
Fair enough. Khalid, your question.
Salvatore, growing up here as an Indian Muslim and living every day in India, and having all these experiences, reality always seemed to me like very different from what I was reading from all these democracy reports and leftist magazines, where I was apparently supposed to be under siege and this Hindu majority is out there to get me, but it was drastically opposite. And it's different. Like my closest friends till date who are after family, the closest are Hindus, right? And I don't even like saying it. I find very cringe to say that they're Hindus. There is freedom of faith to the point that there is freedom of faith to the point of abusing the faith to causing inconvenience to others. And even when I interpolate my lived reality to objective stats, second highest Muslim population out of 200 countries on the planet, out of 50 Muslim majority countries, population of 25 crores, US is 35 crores, second highest number of mosques in the world, right? So what more religious freedom is required? The biggest superstar in the last 3 decades who represents India literally is a Muslim, right? Sports stars, bureaucrats, chief ministers, presidents, and any field you name it, they are there. And then come these VDEM reports, which says that apparently Khalid and Amana are going to face genocide by this loving, secular, tolerant Hindu majority. I'm not saying they're flawless, but most of them are tolerant and they have their radicals.
Genocide Watch says there's a 10% chance of a Muslim genocide in India in the next decade.
Exactly. And they say the same to the third highest community. And I don't say we are a minority because, 25 crores, second largest community, I find it problematic to call it a minority, right? And then third largest Christians at 5 crore and, Sikhs at 2. Yeah. And we've had a Sikh prime minister, right? Fourth largest community, it's just 2.5 crores and he was for 2 times. And now you can help us with the figures that why is our reality not getting translated in the larger canvas of Western media, whereas the constant narrative since decades is this is a hellhole for minorities. I would go to the point this is sometimes even over pampering its minorities. So you can take it from there.
Yeah, look, I've already presented the objective data, and the objective data are pretty clear. That said, individual voices are magnified in the media and especially in social media, and there are Islamophobes on Indian social media who feel a license, and something I find troubling that Islamophobic social media seem to be considered acceptable by many members of the Hindu nationalist right in India. They think it's okay. And it's something I find I've often actually asked people to take things down that they've commented on my tweets, and they think they're supporting me. And I've said, please take that down. I don't approve of any kind of implicit or explicit hate speech on my tweets. And I'll just give you one very pedestrian example. I wrote a review of Pathan. Okay, I thought Pathan was really a good news story for India. I mean, here is a Muslim lead actor, Shah Rukh Khan, playing this ultra patriotic. I mean, so patriotic. I mean, more patriotic than Tom Cruise in Top Gun, right? I mean, this is like, he kicks the villain and it's Jai Hind, and okay, he's as patriotic as you can get, and Indian audiences went wild for it. Incredibly successful movie. And incredibly successful in the diaspora. It was for a while the number 2 movie in Australia, the number 3 movie in America, right? Pathan. So I wrote a review of it, and I pointed all this out. And I said, this is a really good story about the maturation of Indian society, that a Muslim lead character can be accepted as the patriotic Indian lead in a super patriotic film. And I thought this is a good news story. I'm telling Indians, you should be happy about this. And this, I wrote the article for the Western press, so it was published here in Australia. It wasn't published in India. But many of my Indian Twitter followers were very upset. Very upset. All those, none of us are going to see this movie. I can't believe you would compliment this movie. That, Shah Rukh Khan is a, fill in the blank of how, what a terrible person he is. This movie is anti-Hindu and anti-India. And I thought, if this is your vision of an anti-India movie, I hate to see an actual pro-India movie. Like this movie was so pro-India. Like, well, the rogue Pakistani ISI officer helped him out. Like, she was a rogue officer. That's the whole point, So I found that the visceral resistance among a small group, because I know quantitatively, most Indian Hindus love this movie. How do I know? They went to see it. But there is a small group of Indian Hindus who were just livid at the suggestion that this could possibly be that how could you compliment this movie? So I know there is this latent Islamophobia in India. But it's there everywhere. I mean, Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. It's not like India is the only place to experience Islamophobia. Let's be frank about it. It's there. It exists. Now, I can't measure it. Right? I don't have a good survey instrument. What I do have is the Pew Research survey saying that ask the generic question. Indians ask the generic question. Respecting other people's religions is a crucial part of what it means to be Indian. More than 90% of Indian Hindus agree. More than 90% of Indian Muslims agree. So they say that. How much they believe? No one asks the survey question. Are Muslims just as good Indians as Hindus? Right. Well, I don't have that survey question, so I don't know. So I think we should be frank. There clearly is Islamophobia in India. The question is not does it exist. The question is at what level is that? Now, the two of you can talk about your lived experiences of being Indian and where you would peg that level in India versus the UK versus the US. I mean, Islamophobia for a while was so extreme in the U.S. that Sikhs were being pulled off trains because people thought they were Muslim, and they must be terrorists because got a turban on, and so you can peg how serious this is in different countries. It's just a burden that Muslims live with outside Muslim majority countries. It's a reality. The same way there's racism, and Africans live with this if they're outside African countries. The question is not does it exist. The question is how serious is it. And I don't know the answer to that. And I maintain you guys don't know the answer to that either. You only know how serious it is in your milieu and in the milieu of people you've asked about it. But their entire Indian languages that you don't speak.
Right.
Maybe it's more serious there. Right.
Amna had a backup question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing here that there has been 3 Hindu majority state where Hindu majority state has chosen Muslim CM.
Okay.
Chief Minister in India. So it's a very different, it takes a lot of more to understand India. When you live on the ground reality, it's nothing like the social media. Nothing.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know state level politics as well in India as national level politics.
Okay.
Yeah. Salvatore, my backup question to that was, me and Amana, usually ideologically, we are clear about the fact that the biggest threat to India's sovereignty, integrity, peace, a secular fabric, and, just what India, diversity, which even the former Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh said comes from left-wing extremism, right? The Naxalite terrorism. And in addition to that, Islamists who are, seeking to secede. And it's not going to happen in 47. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And their ideologues many times are the same intellectuals. I go back to the first question, who parade themselves as intellectuals, but they're basically Marxist, Naxalite terror supporters, Islamist supporters who are anti-India and would love to see it break into many parts. We feel that's the first threat, right? And second, which is, disproportionately, spoken about, is this small section of what you spoke about, those Hindus who have this absolute rabid hate for Muslims, right? But they don't have, neither are they involved in such terror activities, neither do they have such global backing of all these, newspapers and all. So first of all, want to understand your view on that. And second, do you sometimes fear, as an outsider who can see it more objectively, that tomorrow, at whatever level, these guys might start emulating these Islamist communists, or that will not happen because the scale, the machinery, the ideology, the infrastructure is not there, and the community doesn't have it in such to, have such terror groups which will work. So how do you see both these things?
So first, India is not going to break up. At this point, the borders are secure. And these residual resistance movements are ultimately doomed to failure. And my advice to people in situations like that is just accept making the country you live in the best possible place. I know there are people who desperately want to have independence, but lots of us want things that we don't get to have. And the fact is that India has the democratic mechanisms through which you can self-govern, even if you feel you don't want to be part of the country. So, here, if we talk specifically, about Indian administered Kashmir, in Indian administered Kashmir, people have the vote. Yes, state government was temporarily suspended. It's coming back. That's not an issue. And people there can govern themselves. Can they leave India? No. But I think they're just going to have to accept that they can govern themselves within India and be given a large latitude for self-governance within a larger liberal democratic space. And I think people should just accept that. Most of the terrorism in India today seems to be foreign provoked. And whether that's Khalistani terrorism, which is supported out of Canada, whether that's Kashmiri terrorism, which is supported out of, I see we're having some image problems, Kashmiri terrorism, which is supported out of Pakistan, whether that's Naxalite terrorism supported out of Myanmar or ultimately via China, there's foreign support for it. And that's really unfortunate. We really need to be more, we really need to condemn state sponsorship of terrorism more than we do. I know there's a big infrastructure around condemning state sponsorship of terrorism, but unfortunately, it's been weaponized to just be, machinery for, Russia's a terrible country in many ways. It doesn't sponsor terrorism, yet Russia's put on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Why? Well, it's another list we can put them on. And I really think we should avoid that, and we should really focus these efforts on actual sponsors of terrorism. What we can do about it, I don't know. The Indian state has been criticized for being too heavy-handed in its repression of terrorism. That's an easy criticism to make from the safety of Sydney, Australia. And it's a difficult, challenge when we realize that the people who get killed in Kashmir are Kashmiris. The people who get killed in Punjab are Punjabis, right? And so what level of government repression or control, depending which way you want to see it, is appropriate, I'm reluctant to judge that, especially when it's a democratic country where the people of that country can always eject the government if they're unhappy with the level of repression that's going on.
Right. I want to add something.
Sorry, Amna, I had also another question, Salvatore, about, do you think the small significant section which you said is now suddenly turning completely anti-Muslim might start mirroring the Islamists and communists? Are you?
No, there's simply there. You mean it with terrorism? Yeah, there's simply no evidence of Hindu extremist terrorism. There are.
No, I'm not speaking about terrorism.
Lynchings.
I'm saying the mindset. Do you worry, because you said that with the whole Pathan reaction you felt a little uncomfortable? Do you think?
Look, I think it's unwholesome and uncharitable, and I would encourage Indian Hindus to read more of their own heroes. And I think if they simply asked, what would Vivekananda say? In the same way Christians are encouraged to ask, what would Jesus say? If you ask, what would Vivekananda say about this? I think, what would Ramakrishnan, who's my favorite Hindu philosopher, former president of India, what would he say about this? I think they might come to more charitable conclusions. Look, it's ultimately very childish to stand on your principles. It can sound very admirable that you're absolutely standing on your principles regardless, but we adults grow up to realize that many people have different weaknesses. Everybody has different preferences. And instead of absolutely standing firm on what we believe, yeah, we accept that we all live in society together. We accept others who make compromises. Now, it's not only Hindus I'm asking to make compromises. And I'm sorry, Amana, I'm just going to say one more thing. I was in Varanasi. Now we all know about the Ram Mandir, Babri Masjid controversy, and I've told very activist Hindus, people in the VJP and the RSS, look, it was absolutely wrong to for a mob to tear down this temple. Okay, absolutely wrong. Even if the court later said you could build tear down the mosque, I'm sorry. Even if the court said you could later build a temple, fine, wait till the court adjudicates. But I can't, no matter how passionate you are that this is my ground, yeah, we don't endorse, I'm not going to endorse mob violence, no matter how righteous your cause. But at the same time, I was just in Varanasi. There is the Vishwanath temple there. Clearly, the old temple had a mosque built over it. It's not an especially holy mosque. So this mosque is not, you know, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where, okay, it's a big problem. I mean, if Israel tears down the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's where Muhammad ascended to heaven, right? I mean, this is a really important site for Islam. This is just a neighborhood mosque that nobody uses. Could an arrangement be made where the local Waqf board is compensated for? Yeah, it seems like, you know, instead of standing on the principle that Indian law says that no place of worship should ever be alienated, yeah, I think local Muslims could say, you know what, this is the second most holy site, or for Varanasians, the most holy site for Shiva devotees, the most holy site in all of Shivaism. Yeah, we can give them that building. We'll take $10 million. We'll build a really nice mosque and cultural center somewhere else, and everyone will be happy, right? So I think we could have maturity on both sides of these debates. Would go a long way towards improving.
I'm with you on that.
In total agreement, it would be great if Indian Muslim would start reconciliation like that, but I think that won't happen. However, when any judgment come from the court, Indian Muslim will follow that. That I'm assured.
Yeah.
They will follow, but after fighting the case, they won't go for the reconciliation in the pre-phase, which is a very problematic event. So, but what I wanted to add, basically, I was working in think tank in India. So when I was working there, my project was about the militant atrocities on Jammu Kashmir civilians. And when I collected the data, and most of the victims are Kashmiri Muslims. Men were more because they get out more, so they will become more victim. Plus, there have been so many reports where militant will rape the Kashmiri Muslim women, and nobody report that, nobody talks about that, and nobody talks how they have been so evil for the society. They are not bringing any solution, and they are just torturing the civilians in the end. So this biasness in the narrative is also very visible when it comes to India. Like, state is the only evil. Nobody wants to talk about from the other sides. So that's what I wanted to add here.
Okay. Yeah, and terrorism really does victimize the local population most of all. I mean, even if you don't have those kinds of atrocities, the simple fact is terrorism is about social control. And no one wants terrorists to be running their neighborhoods, to be running their cities, to be shaking them down for protection money. I mean, no one wants, let's face it, men with guns running their neighborhoods. Even if you support their political agenda, it's just not what decent people want for themselves.
Yeah, when people get killed by the terrorist bomb or something, Indian Muslim also gets killed in that attack. It's not that they are just choosing Hindu and killing them.
Even if not a single Muslim was killed in these attacks, still, I think I don't have any information. I've never done interviews in Kashmir. I don't have that information. But around the world, the host populations of terrorists rarely seem to actually want to be host populations for terrorists. People just want to live a decent life.
No, there is no justification, but I'm just talking about the perspective. Like, a lot of terrorists make a point that we are fighting for the Muslims, but you're killing the innocent Muslim as well. So then you are like not standing by your own ideology as well. So that was my point. And no innocent will be killed by any violence. So I think we should just go for some normal question. We have been talking a lot about serious stuff. So how have been your journey in India?
Look, it's a lot of fun. It's been really endearing that so many people have wanted to meet me and talk to me. And at the literature festivals I attended, in particular the Art Festival, I spent 3 days at the Art Festival just talking to large groups, mostly of young people, a few people my age, but mostly young people who just wanted to talk. And so I spent 4 or 5 hours standing out under a tree. I felt like the Buddha. I joked with them that we've all become Buddhists here, standing under the tree because we wanted shade. Now we know why Buddha preached under a tree. He needed the shade. And just sitting, standing under the tree talking was really the best part of my whole trip. I really did. I learned a lot from it, but it was also very gratifying to have the opportunity to talk to so many people.
Since you're so objective, Salvatore, and I'm really loving the objectivity you bring to the table, you're so honest to your work, and you just treat it as a subject, you're not getting swayed by the populist things, and you're saying what is really intellectually honest to you. 3 things you liked about India, 3 things you didn't like about it.
So first, if I'm honest, it's because these are not my fights. Right? I have no stake in any of this. And so similarly about India, people seem to think, they tell me, Salvatore, when did you fall in love with India? And I keep telling them, I'm sorry, guys, I'm not particularly in love with India. In fact, I never even visited India until November when I was invited to the India Today conclave. I'm writing a book about Indian democracy, and I didn't even bother to visit the country because I'm just working with the data and the documents. So, what don't I like about India? The pollution. I mean, breathing that air is terrible. The litter. In Indian cities, I've never been to the countryside, but in each of the Indian cities I've visited, there's litter everywhere. It just is endless. And finally, the VIP culture. Look, in the kind of countries I'd like to live in, we all take the train. We all walk the same street. None of this like chauffeured around and siren on the car because you're more important. The VIP culture I find really a turnoff. Things I like about India, that people are much more approachable. So in Australia, you would never have the casual conversations in Australia, or maybe in the US. The US also has that kind of approach, but India, people seem to be extremely approachable. Now that may be because I'm a foreigner. I don't know how true that is, among Indians themselves. So people were very approachable. Second thing I like about India is the food. I am vegetarian, so it's very convenient to eat the food in India. And I joke with people, as I've always joked, I can become Muslim because I don't eat pork and I don't drink alcohol. I can become Hindu because I'm vegetarian. I could almost become Jain, but I'd have to give up potatoes. That's tough, giving up the potatoes. I do like potatoes. So being vegetarian in India just gives you lots of options. You can eat food everywhere. You're not stuck with the one vegetarian option at the restaurant you visit. And I guess a third thing I like about India, now you'll see I'm embarrassing myself because I'm trying to think of what's the third thing I like about India. I'm not sure. But I will say a third compliment about India, if I can, instead of something I personally like. Journalism in India is of exceptionally high quality. And I've been reading Indian newspapers now for 3 years. And I have to say, for all that Indians knock it, the journalism in India is of extremely high quality. American journalism is so politicized, you almost can't read it. I mean, you have to read between the lines for everything. And I don't mean the opinion coverage, I mean the news coverage. You have to read everything between the lines. Australia has very limited journalism, and you don't get a lot of the details of stories. And I found Indian journalism just to be really refreshingly factual. It's of a very high standard. In fact, I watched the entire Ukrainian invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I watched it all on India Today. And that was months before India Today ever invited me to the conclave. I had no connection with India Today, but I was there watching Gaurav Savant, reporting live from Ukraine. And the coverage was just so straightforward, factual, honest, neither pro-Putin nor pro-Zelensky. It was just coverage. So yeah, the journalism is another thing I really like about India. Maybe I'm the only person in the world, including in India, who likes Indian journalism, but I really do.
I mean, you like Indian journalism, and India is not the most dangerous place for journalists. It's in fact one of the safest.
Well, I'll let the journalists opine on that.
Right. Amna's, any more fun questions for Salvatore regarding his India trip?
No, actually, I wanted to ask about the movie he has watched, but he already
Right.
has talked about.
Oh, I've reviewed. So I like reviewing Indian movies. I don't get to watch a lot of Indian movies, but I've reviewed Kashmir Files. If you want to talk more about Kashmir, I've reviewed RRR,
Oh, okay.
and I've reviewed Pathan. All of them for an Australian, of all of them for various Australian news sites, because I think it's really interesting to to follow a country through its movies.
RR
The one
just
movie I
won the Oscars and also the Golden Globes the other.
Yeah. Well, Desi Nacho, depending which language you're watching it in. Yeah, it was great. My wife and I really enjoyed RR. It was over the top, but it was amusingly over the top. Yeah.
Your favorite Indian celebrity?
I haven't seen his movies yet, but my new favorite Indian celebrity is Salman Khan. And I have to say, when I saw, and now I've seen him everywhere. Once I saw him in Pathan, I then saw him on every single advertisement billboard everywhere in India. He seems to sell every product imaginable. But he was so charismatic. And in the movie, they're on the Russian train, and there's some whistle, and the scarf comes down through. And of course, I went to see that movie myself and a Taiwanese professor friend of mine.
Okay.
It went out to the Indian suburbs of Sydney, in Western Sydney, to see the movie. Everyone else in the audience knew exactly what the scarf meant coming down through. For us, it was just, why is there a scarf? And then the bad guy gets, pulled up by the scarf and his neck broken. And Tiger comes down, and now I think, okay, I want to see the Tiger movies. That's next on my must-watch list, is to see all the Tiger movies. And he was so charismatic and so much fun. And what's funny is I thought I liked Shah Rukh Khan until I saw Salman Khan, and he's so much more charismatic, fun, interesting to watch, that I thought, okay, now I have a new favorite Indian.
Within India, he's the biggest star. Globally, Shah Rukh's the biggest star, but within India, they call him Salman Bhai, for brother. So that's how they refer to him. Bhai. Like they'll say Bhai's movie is coming out. So he does connect with across the spectrum, from the guy driving the rickshaw to the guy in the limousine, and they're all big fans of him. And the biggest topic of discussion in India is always when he'll get married, because he's a bachelor at 56. Amna, I want you to ask the final question. I mean, we start from politics. Maybe ask about his favorite politician, about Modi, Raga. You can.
Yeah. Any comment about the Indian politician? Yeah.
Look, I don't have much comment about Modi because everyone's always talked so much about Modi. I will say that in the book I'm working on Indian democracy, my first chapter, instead of focusing on Modi, focuses on the yogi. So it's using Yogi Adityanath as an introduction to India for Western audiences, because the story of the poor boy rising up to become prime minister, that could happen in England, that could happen in America. I mean, that's not especially a particularly Indian story. Yogi Adityanath, it couldn't happen anywhere else. And so I use the yogi, and because it's Uttar Pradesh, and that's the Taj Mahal, and and also the Ram Mandir and Varanasi, and so many things that are emblematic of India are in Uttar Pradesh. I actually use the yogi as emblematic of Indian democracy, and he's a really interesting figure. Obviously, when he first became chief minister, there were a lot of concerns about his Muslim baiting. I mean, he did make a lot of Islamophobic remarks, which seem to have been quashed by Modi and Shah. They seem to have told him to behave himself better, and he seems to behave himself better. But then he's turned out to be a very successful administrator. Everyone seems to agree he's been a successful administrator. One story I tell is that he outlawed cheating on the civil service exam. And of course, for Westerners, that's a bizarre notion. Like, of course you can't cheat on a civil service exam. It's like, no. In Uttar Pradesh, until the yogi, cheating was allowed, right? You were allowed to bring in your mobile phone. You were allowed to bring in your answer sheets. You were allowed to call people and say, what's the answer to this question? And he outlawed cheating. Now, that is reorienting for Westerners. If you want to understand the problems of Indian democracy, to what extent are they really just problems of poverty? To what extent are they really just problems of tradition, and not so much problems of Hindu nationalism or problems of bigotry? And so here we have the case of someone who, in his language, was clearly bigoted in his first year. Whether he's bigoted in his heart, I don't know. A lot of people from traditional backgrounds have casual bigotry, where they're just, they don't really have any. And he always said, "Oh no, lots of Muslims come to my, the
Mat.
the mat. Lots of Muslims come to the Gorakhpur mat, and we have lots of Muslims love me and all that. And so there's a lot of this kind of casual bigotry among people from traditional backgrounds in every country, right? So one way to read the Aditya story is, country boy. Yeah, he said a lot of rough around the edges things. He kind of was whipped into shape. You can't say these things. And yet, but Muslims generally like him. And so I set this up as, which way do we understand this? Do we understand this as an evil, an evil bigot exploiting Islamophobia for electoral gain? Or do we understand this as a rough around the edges, but well-meaning person who is popular because he brings good administration to his state? And the answer is probably a little of both. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, and I don't offer an answer in the book. Okay. I offer the question in the book. So, for example, the anti-forced conversion laws and the whole, anti-Romeo squads and all of this. I said, well, okay, clearly this was playing on Hindu fears of Muslim masculinity. Okay, that's obvious. But I put the question to people: if Muslim fathers in Uttar Pradesh were offered the option, should fathers be able to veto the marriage choices of their daughters? Yeah, you'd win that vote.
By a huge margin.
By a landslide. So when Adityanath effectively says that if you're unhappy about your child's marital choice, you can come complain to us. Yeah, well, okay, that can be read as deeply illiberal towards children. On the other hand, it can be read as, a good way to prevent riots from breaking out, because when parents are upset, there's some official they can go to complain to, instead of having to have the brother honor kill the groom. We have better ways to solve. So, and again, I problematize this for the audience. I'm not solving the question. I'm raising that this is a different kind of political sociology from that you're familiar with in California or New South Wales. And this is the environment in which you have to understand Indian democracy. Indian democracy is not democracy in the US, Canada, even France, or Indian democracy is democracy in a country that has a GDP per capita equivalent to that of sub-Saharan Africa. Uttar Pradesh is at Rwanda's level. Bihar is at Congo's level. How do you run a democracy in Rwanda without a genocide? Well, Rwanda hasn't solved that, but I think Uttar Pradesh maybe has, and I think that's something that we should view as a relative success, even if not an absolute perfection that we'd like it to be.
When is the book out?
Probably next January.
Oh, okay, all right. So we look forward to that book, and hopefully we discuss it here.
I have one more question. Sorry.
Yeah.
After this, this episode, this talk about the UP government and this anti-Romeo law, anti-conversion law, actually. So, to be fair, as I'm a woman, when I look at this problem, I see it as a very misogynist mindset, which is the root cause.
It's an attempt to control female sexuality. Absolutely.
Exactly. Because you see women as a property of your own family, and it's related to your honor. So the basic root problem is that, and it will take a lot of time before we can reform that, because there is a certain reality of India, and it will take time, but we have to work in that direction, because women cannot be victim forever of your mindset. You have to change your mindset. So there, there I differ as a woman, because I don't want to give up my own right to choose my partner. I want to have my own what it's called, like my own
agency.
Yeah. So, but the question was, what I want to ask you, like when we talk about this anti-conversion law and everything, so there was a lot of talk about the love jihad. Have you heard
Yeah.
about it?
Yeah,
And
of course. Yeah, the whole
what
section
do,
of the book is on love jihad. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, basically I am reading a lot about it, but I don't find any proper survey or any data which can,
No, no data. It's all press reports. Yeah.
yeah. So how would you see as a statist who's working with the
Well,
statistic?
I can't analyze it statistically. Instead, I use it as a framing device. So, you and I are both progressive on gender issues. Okay, I think we can take that for granted. Let's hope Khalid is as well. Okay, so we're all modern progressive liberals on these issues. Can you run a democracy? Can you run a liberal democracy in a society where if you held a referendum, should women be required to be virgins until marriage, and their marriage partners must be approved by their fathers? So if that referendum, and I believe in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, I think we would win that referendum. Okay. So can you have a democracy under these conditions? Because if you allow true democratic choice, that true democratic choice will produce an illiberal, anti-feminist outcome. So the only solution we have is not to allow democracy, right? Ironically. So in order to have a liberal democracy, we have to restrain democracy. Now, I would call that leadership, right? In order to have this democracy, we have to have leadership where leaders say, I'm going to pull the population along with me on what's right, even if they may not like it. That's a very challenging, that's a very big challenge to put to any politician. I submit to you that the problem that we're dealing with here, the problem of politics is only secondary. The real problem is a problem of society. Okay. So, for example, gay marriage was only allowed in the United States. I mean, in the 2010s, there was finally a Supreme Court ruling, but it was only in the 2010s that state after state started to legislate gay marriage. Now, I've supported the idea of gay marriage for as long as I've known about the issue, right? I mean, people ask, should gay people be allowed to? Of course, gay people should be allowed to marry. Why shouldn't they? But the problem is, if you would run this referendum, because there were referendums all throughout the 2010s in state after state, where the referendum, I think almost every referendum went in favor of allowing gay marriage until the Supreme Court stepped in and put an end to the process. If you had run those same referendums in 1975, you would have lost them, right? The US would have voted against gay marriage. Now, would that have, like, what do you do? I mean, it's, so you have this illiberal population in the US that in 1975 didn't accept gay rights. Well, you can either impose gay rights against democracy, or you can prohibit gay rights and be a democracy. Which one is more important, liberalism or democracy? And that's a tough challenge to have. Now, countries like the US and Australia are at the frontier of this, where we're pushing individual rights really as far as they can go today. We know they'll go farther tomorrow, but we always think we're so self-righteous that the rights we have today are incredible, or we're just on the edge of having the magical rights we're supposed to have, until tomorrow someone says, well, what about this? Shouldn't they have rights too? And then you have to push a little farther. But if India is 50 years behind on that, is that okay? I mean, how far behind is okay? And I think we have these absolute standards often applied by international liberals that if any country is more than 4 years behind, the European Union and the United States, damn them, how dare they do this? And I think, well, there but for the grace of God go thee. I mean, 10 years ago, you didn't agree with this liberal reform. How can you chastise a poorer, less developed country for not yet being there? And I think this is really the issue we have with women's rights in India, with well, especially with women's rights, with sexual minority rights in India. I know it hasn't been as much problematized as in India as it maybe in other countries. With many of these questions, it's simply how far ahead of the population can the polity go? And I think it's very dangerous for democracy when courts step in and force solutions on society that society is not quite ready for, because then it creates resentment, it creates distrust, it creates populist movements to overturn that judgment. It may be unsatisfying, but yeah, women's rights in India gonna have to wait a little longer. And I don't say that as a man who's imposing some masculinist solution. I'm just saying that as someone who just visited India, and you know what? Yes, in media there were plenty of women, but every political leader I met was either a man or a daughter of a powerful man, right? There's still that. Every business leader I met was a man, right? Yeah, it's kind of like the U.S. 20 years ago when there were women in human resources, maybe in legal department, but all the executives were men, right? Well, if that's only changed in the last 20 years in the United States, UK, and Australia, well, are we so surprised that we're not there yet in India?
Yeah, things are changing for India as well.
I mean, it'll change.
Because growing up, I used to have so much problem, like violence against Indian women. Even women used to get killed in the womb, which has reduced drastically. And I do give Congress government the due praise for this, because they have done such good work there. They have been they have understood the Indian mindset. They understood that Indian population is not ready, but they used to push this kind of policy to create awareness. So they have done work there.
Yeah.
So there is I'm going, maybe Indian right wing won't like it, what I'm going to say right now. But there has been, and I think we should discuss that also. So when I see the liberal criticism of this government a lot of time, so they don't say ki there is not a problem. They say there is this societal problem, but how we will solve that problem is the issue. They feel the government pushing the policies which is kind of more supporting the segregation of two community, where people from two community want to get married, there would be policy now coming in between, and they won't let them to get married. I don't agree with them, because when I read the policies, I don't see that black and white. It's not that they have banned interreligious marriages. They just banned the conversion. Like, you don't need to convert the women, and which is good thing. Why women should convert their religion? This is very pro women choice. Like, women should not convert their religion to get married, actually. But I think we should address the liberal class criticism if they are making some point which could be valid. So the right winger, I think, fail there to indulge with the conversation with them, instead of they just attack each other rather than having a proper conversation. So yeah, that I wanted to add.
Yeah, look, the first step here is the Uniform Civil Code. It is bizarre, and look, it's something that I talk to international audiences about.
Yeah.
They're completely unaware when I tell them that family law for Muslims in India is different from family law for the rest of society, and they say, how can that be? And I say, well, and that self-described liberals consider the Uniform Civil Code to be an oppressive majoritarian measure is just unconscionable. Exactly. It's simply unconscionable. Now, I'm very aware that the pressure for a Uniform Civil Code comes from irate Hindu nationalists who are upset that they lost their Hindu code, right? I mean, I'm aware that the motivations for it are not pure as snow, right? The motivations for it can be petty, petulant, communal, but often good things are done for bad reasons. And if it takes, these bad reasons to get, now once you have a Uniform Civil Code, the forced conversion issue becomes much less, the salience drops dramatically, because the reason for the automatic conversion at marriage is which family law is going to apply to you. And if you're I think the law in most places is that if you're a woman, the family law of the man applies to you. Is that correct? I don't know all the various state laws in India. But that's the problem. You can't have two separate. Now, of course, you can have a civil marriage in which you agree that you will be governed by, not governed by, but all this mess really should just be resolved. And it may be that the Uniform Civil Code is not the current civil code. It may be a civil code that's amended to take into account the amalgamation of the Muslim code and the uniform and the civil code, but it's the first step towards a solution of all these problems. It's an obvious first step, and presumably, look, I know the BJP has been working toward. It's one of their big 3 items. They've got the other 2 already. What was it? Article 370,
and
that's gone. Ram Mandir, that's done. Okay, Universal Civil Code is the next thing on the agenda. They'll presumably do it after the 2024 election. But it really can't come too soon. And I think we should just be frank about things, that yes, sometimes good things are done for bad reasons. I don't think the reasons it's being promoted are really very pure, but that doesn't mean that as a liberal, I don't support it. As a liberal, of course, I support a uniform civil code.
As an Indian Muslim, I do support it because I have seen so many. I mean, it's been 75 years till we got our freedom, but still Indian Muslim women are getting treated as a second-class citizen in India and in front of the law. I mean, legally we don't have equal rights, so we need uniform civil code for sure. That's what I'm hoping for, and that's what liberals should support. And the irony is that when Modi government banned the triple talaq, the liberals should have been celebrating that. But they were not. They were against it, and I never understood why. I, as an Indian Muslim, I was so happy, but they were not. That's the irony of it.
India's liberals. Now, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a political sociologist, but I do dabble in political science occasionally. If I were to give some electoral advice to India's liberals, and especially Congress Party, it would be to steal a leaf from the BJP. They're always accusing the BJP of taking Congress policies and implementing them better, and then taking credit for them. So the pro-poor policies, the direct benefit transfers, they say, oh, direct benefit transfer was a Congress policy. How dare they adopt our policy and do it better than we did it? And the answer is, if it's a good policy, it's a good policy. Why shouldn't they do it? And I think in the same way, if the BJP is going to promote a uniform civil code, if it's a good policy, take it away from them. Do it better than they would do it. Make it your policy. Make it, complain. BJP has been in power for 10 years. They said in their electoral program 10 years ago that uniform civil code was one of their top 3 priorities. Why haven't they done it yet? Right? So campaigning, the Congress could turn this into a campaign issue instead of shying away from it. And I know there's vote bank politics involved, all of this, but I really think that they would do well to simply stand on what are good policies, regardless of who else might support them. But that's principled politics, and it's easy to be a principled politician when you're an academic and not having to win votes.
True.
But Rahul's right now in UK a week back, and he said democracy is dead, and he took those VDEM rankings too seriously. So he's clearly not wanting to do that.
Well, but and I keep joking. I've been trolling people on Twitter with this, because if democracy's dead, why is he contesting the elections? Then you don't really believe that democracy's dead, right? If you really believe democracy's dead, withdraw from politics and say I'm boycotting the elections because they're not meaningful. And nobody believes that democracy's dead in India.
Exactly.
Practically speaking.
All right. On that note, we'd like to end this fascinating discussion we had with Salvatore Babones. And the best part of it was that what I really liked about is he was so objective to his field of study, to his field of expertise, not playing to any gallery. We're seeing that with so many people who just hit fame in India, and then they just start playing to the gallery, and people think, oh, here's the white messiah, he's finally come. So he's not running for followers, he's running for what he feels is intellectually honest. So enjoyed this. We look forward next time when your book releases, we want to talk about that. And an open invitation, please do visit us when you're here next time in India. And it was an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you so much, Salvatore.
Thank you for the invitation.
All right, guys, this was one more episode of India This Week. We hope you liked it. We try our best to get the best of guests who are different, objective, who are so intellectually honest. So please do like, share, and subscribe. Press that icon button, because only when you press the bell icon button, you will get a notification. And you also, on the pinned comment, you can become a membership. That helps us, because now we spend a considerable number of time from our main jobs into this. And also our Patreon link is there. You can be a member. You can subscribe to that, become a member, and help us there as well. Thank you so much. See you next week. Bye-bye.